Hello and welcome. I'm Charles Keedon, the Executive Editor of Alliance Magazine. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at the relationship between philanthropy and the law. Before I introduce our guests, why not say hello in our chat on the right-hand side of your screen to one another? You can also join the discussion on Twitter @AllianceMag and use the hashtag #LawPhilanthropy. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, make sure to ask them in the chat and we'll do our best to pick these up as we go along. Here at Alliance Magazine, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary, and we're offering everyone on this webinar a 20% discount on an Alliance subscription. Just use the offers button on the right-hand side of your screen below the chat function, and that way you'll be able to read the exciting new issue that we'll be discussing in a moment. So make sure you get your discount today. I'm delighted today to be joined by an all-star foundation panel, including the guest editors of our law issue, Nicolette Naylor and David Sampson of the Ford and Baring Foundations, respectively, as well as the Mott Foundation's Lorenzo Wakefield, who also contributed to this issue. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and we'll try to leave plenty of time for the discussion. In their lead article for this issue, Nicolette and David point out that philanthropic engagement with the law goes well beyond high-profile court cases. Instead, they assert that legal philanthropy is arguably at its most profound and purposeful when helping to enlarge the space for communities themselves to seek justice. So does this represent a shift in thinking in philanthropic legal practice? And will the next 25 years of philanthropy in the law look rather different to the last 25? So first of all, to gaze into the past and explore what's coming up, I'm delighted to welcome Nicolette Naylor. Nicolette is director of the Ford Foundation in Southern Africa and also director of Ford's International Programme for Gender, Racial and Ethnic Justice. Nicolette's going to just speak for a few minutes to really explain why she feels it's time for funders to take an even more expansive view of legal funding, and as she argues in her article with David Sampson, to reimagine justice. And she'll also share some thoughts on how the Ford Foundation's own work has changed during this period. So delighted to welcome you, and over to you, Nicolette.
Thank you, Charles. I'm so excited to be here with everyone today to talk about an issue that I'm quite passionate about. I'm really excited about the edition. I think when David and I started to think about this issue, we wanted to celebrate some of the achievements in the field, and we wanted to demystify the law and supporting legal action for the philanthropy community at large. I was particularly keen for us to adopt a much more expansive view of legal funding, as you point out, as one of the many strategic tools in our philanthropy toolboxes, and to reimagine what this could look like beyond the narrow frame of litigation or court work, and really looking at that spectrum of what legal action can mean for reimagining justice and work on disrupting inequality. David and I also wanted to deal with what success looks like and how we measure impact and success in this field beyond wins or losses, because legal action can catalyze many different forms of change and often shift the hearts and minds of people, even where there's a loss. So I've been so impressed by the articles that really tell powerful stories of change and how ordinary citizens can use the law to bring about change, because we are all in the business of social change. And I think the stories of voice and agency and power building came through quite strongly for me in terms of a continuum. And the picture that we're painting around our litigation, coupled with organizing and mobilizing and advocacy from the bottom up, can actually yield powerful results. But I also wanted to be clear that we're not romanticizing law and litigation, because on its own it can't change the world. So we do heed the warning message from some of the authors on expecting the law to be the only answer for complex social and political problems. But I still believe in the symbolic significance of the work and the power of rendering the invisible issues visible. I think we've heard from colleagues writing in this edition that there's some power. We saw the work being done by women's rights organizations, Me Too, to the work by African organizations to advance the rule of law or push the boundaries on issues like LGBT or education or socioeconomic rights. So very exciting edition. Let me turn to Ford's engagement in this work over many decades as the Ford Foundation. And I want to just go back in time even more than 25 years, because in 1977, the board of Ford actually approved for Ford to do work in South Africa on expanding our role in human rights. And remember, that was at the height of apartheid in South Africa. And our purpose was then to establish much deeper relationships with a group of lawyers that were doing political defense work to challenge apartheid. And these South African lawyers became aware of new types of legal institutions in the United States, in Britain, in Australia, around legal aid for the poor and public interest law firms that defended the rights of the public, and civil rights law groups like the NAACP that were advancing major rights through litigation. So in 1978, Ford did some experimental grants to promote international collaboration in structuring new forms of legal aid and public interest law institutions inside South Africa. And the reason we could do this was because in the 70s, Ford was deeply engaged in helping US lawyers institutionalize public interest law in the United States. And so this concept that these public interest law firms would be able to work to promote and protect human rights was really at the core of what we tried to do. And so we started to do some cross collaboration, building alliances between South African lawyers, US advocacy institutions, and vice versa. And we started to establish some of the first law centers and public interest law centers in South Africa, and expanded to setting up similar entities in Zimbabwe and Namibia, and then continue to work to connect public interest lawyers in the global south, most notably in India. And so I think Ford has supported this movement of lawyers for public interest over many decades and in many locations around the world. And what we've learned over the decades is that you need a robust and healthy ecosystem. So we have coupled that support with other forms of legal action at community level in more recent years, and have worked to bring lawyers, community paralegals, researchers, artists, academics together to work around social change. Because we know that the next frontier of this work requires us to really make sure that we're bridging the gap between what communities want and need and what happens in legal spaces, to move to what I think Lorenzo writes about, people-centered justice. And if I fast forward quickly to October last year, the Ford Foundation, this is how our work has really evolved. We continue to support this work. We see it as a long-term endeavor, and we're doubling our funding support for US-based racial justice and civil rights group. We announced $180 million in new funding. And this new funding is to boost Ford's ongoing commitment to racial equity and racial justice in America. And we're directing these funds to groups that are creating structural change through strategic litigation, policy advocacy, and grassroots organizing, recognizing the importance of not only doing the litigation, but also doing the grassroots organizing. And our most urgent priority with this infusion of funds is to meet activists and litigators where they are and ensure that groups on the ground at this historic moment of racial reckoning have the resilience and the resources they need to build the future that we want. And in Southern Africa, a similar process, we've looked at how do we invest in the legal sector in ways that are less about individual sexy cases, but actually how do you strengthen the legal sector based on their own strength and resilience for the long haul. And we're trying to actually go back to the 70s to say, how do you foster more cross-border solidarity and South-South connections? Because the issues the world faces today, from misogyny to white supremacy, require stronger alliances and networks of organizations where we're really building and learning from each other at the global level and at that transnational level. Let me stop there. I've said a lot. Thank you, Charles.
Ford Foundation was supporting work overseas, providing advice for an insight that benefited the South African philanthropy sector. But typically, legal philanthropy has been dominated by the US. I think it was up to 90% of all philanthropy is still concentrated in the US. And I just wondered why you think that is, Nicolette, and whether we need to see a more even distribution of funding globally.
Definitely, David. Charles, David and I were also talking about this, that you have a global north, the concentration of money in the global north to fund this kind of work. We have to start spreading that more to the global south. And I'm all for building those alliances. I think the history of the US foundations and the support for legal work is a strong history and a strong foundation for us to build on. But I really think that particularly global foundations, if you think of the Open Society, the Atlantic Philanthropies, that have really started to seed this work across other parts of the world, that's really the next frontier. We have to globalize the movement for legal action, and funders have to start thinking about this work and committing more resources to it. And I think there's been a lot more willingness on US funders to start to see and make the connections between the success of this work and the long history of the work. And I think other funders may be a bit more nervous to engage in this space. If I look at the Ford Foundation, not all our offices engage in this work. Context does matter. But I think the skepticism and the lack of funding in this space has largely been because of conversations around success, impact, or nervousness about whether or not it's appropriate for us to engage in this field. We are actually hoping this edition will show people that you can engage in this field and have some success in many parts of the world. And I think our Africa contributions came through quite strongly to show us that there's a lot of work that can be done. There's a lot of results you can be seeing on the African continent. And we have to start getting massive investments like the 180 million we are putting into the US work at the moment in the Ford Foundation. We want to see big investments like that into Africa legal infrastructure. I think that would be fascinating. That would be exciting for all of us.
Thank you, Nicolette. And it indeed will be interesting to see whether in the next 25 years we will see that globalization of legal philanthropy and less of a concentration on or reliance on the US. But thank you for those opening comments. I'd like to, before we turn to David Sampson, just run a quick poll to get the views of the over 100 people that are joining us here. So if you look at, click on the poll button or look on the right-hand side of your screen at the first poll, you'll see the question as follows. What is the most effective way for philanthropy to use the law to support progressive social change? And here we list a series of options. And please just vote for the one that you think, I know that many of them will be interconnected, but please vote for the one that you think most closely matches what you think the most effective way is. Is it funding practice public interest law, or fourth, bringing legal? And of course, if none of those questions fit with your thoughts, then please do add in the chat where you think the priorities should be. And just again, a reminder that please do use the chat for your questions and your comments. So just looking at the responses here, and very much in line with some of the vision that Nicolette was setting out, over or around 50% of you are saying that funding paralegal work and movement building across poor communities is the most effective way. And then 20% on legal cases for strategic litigation, 12% on funding fellowships, and 15% on legal expertise in your own organization's existing funding areas. So thank you for that feedback. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to David Sampson, who is the Deputy Director of the Baring Foundation, which is one of the UK's leading legal funders. Welcome, David. And David, just to turn to you, you originally actually at the Baring Foundation proposed a feature on law and social change over, I think, 12 to 18 months ago. What was your thinking at the time when you wanted to see some more coverage in our sector about that? And which contributions have stood out for you?
Thanks, Charles, and it's really good to be here with everybody today. I want to say a big thank you to all of the team at Alliance who've worked with me and Nicolette on this edition. It's been a really exciting and interesting journey for us, and I appreciate the guidance they provided to us as grant makers rather than journalists on what works and what doesn't, and I think it's led to a really great addition. When we first started talking about this work internally at the foundation, it was really about the fact that we know within our own networks the work which is taking place. We saw really great examples of legal action in certain other parts of our networks that we weren't expecting to, but we were very conscious that we felt like we were missing out on a community of practice at the global level, an understanding of the different aspects of legal action which philanthropy was funding in different jurisdictions. As you and Nicolette have already spoken about, a lot of this work takes place in the US. Much of the academic literature sits in that area as well. And we were conscious that we saw great work happening in our international development programs in sub-Saharan Africa, which was getting often missed, I think, and certainly wasn't connected to other areas of our work. And so this felt like a really good way to start being able to connect those different aspects of legal action and philanthropy. And to really, I hope, take this as the first step in building those communities of practice and connecting us better on these issues to be able to understand both the work which is being done, but how other funders can take their first steps in this area as well. And I hope everybody on the call has enjoyed the articles which are there. And if you haven't had an opportunity to look at the edition in full, I really urge you to, because there's enormous amounts of rich activity which is taking place. I think that a word which has resonated for me in Nicolette's comments is ecosystem. And the articles here demonstrate the wide variety of work which is taking place. And I think it speaks to the poll which we've just done in terms of the variety of ways that funders can focus in this space. A couple of things which stood out for me on in areas which we're developing were both the development of the legal foundation, the litigation foundation. In this article, in this edition, the Digital Freedom Fund was highlighted and the work that they're doing around digital rights in Europe. Another example might be the File Foundation and the work that they're doing in environmental law. And for me, this is a really interesting new development, because it's often very large generalist foundations seeding money to new areas of work and really creating organizations which are agile in their grant making around legal action and are building these communities of practice in very new ways, and certainly building our thinking and understanding as a field, which I think is really exciting. The flip side of that is all of the breadth of work which is being done to root and center communities at the heart of all the work which is being done around legal action. And I was really moved by a lot of the work which we saw in some of the articles in this edition. And like Nicolette, for us at the Bearing Foundation, legal action is only of any value if it means that social change can be achieved by those communities who are working on it, that their goals are realized through these kind of processes. And it feels like there is a sea change happening, both in the way that legal action is being used by civil society, but how we as philanthropy are supporting that as well. And that for me is really important and exciting. And both of those different aspects speak both to understanding and emphasis on the ecosystem, the broad range of work which needs to happen in this field, but also with our own experience as a foundation. Most of our work in terms of funding legal action is in the UK, and we fund in all 4 nations. But over the last 5 years, where we've really focused on legal action as a tool of social change and really brought that purposive effort to it in the way that Nicolette was talking about the journey of the Ford Foundation, we've continued to experiment with what that looks like. And as we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has meant that we've also had to roll with the punches in terms of what and how we do our work. And so in the last year, we've done far more at the coalface of litigation and action in the courtroom than we ever thought we would as a foundation, which really looks to root work in civil society and develop the long-term capacity of that work. But we took a very specific view in 2020 that we needed to support organisations to use legal action to engage with the vast swathes of rapid public policy change which were taking place in the UK related to the coronavirus pandemic. So that's meant very fast-moving grant making in relation to things like the wholesale transfer of public data from the National Health Service to private companies, to the calls for a public inquiry into the coronavirus pandemic and the public decision-making behind it. And that for us felt like we had to take those decisions in that moment and support that kind of work. But it sits alongside the root of the programme, which has really always been about long-term resourcing for that ecosystem of legal expertise and a knowledgeable and confident sector which feels comfortable using these tools and rooting them in the kind of broader strategies that they have for the social change that they want to see. And so our longer term programme has always been about providing that funding and creating and engaging civil society and understanding this work. And it's something that we're returning to now. And it felt to me that both of those two strategies resonate for a lot of the funders who were writing in these different articles as well. I think that for both Nicolette and I, when we were thinking about the way we wanted to frame this, it was always about what are the access points for those who are thinking about this for the first time in their grant making programs, as well as those who are using it all the time and as a kind of routine part of their grant making. And the more I've thought about this, the more I've thought about the evidence which has been laid out in this edition, the more I simply believe that actually the elements of good grant making in this space are the elements of good grant making which read across so many areas of our work. We need to understand what our grant holders are doing. We need to understand the need of the communities that we're seeking to serve. And we need to make grants which are both accessible and long-term for the kind of work which needs to happen. We've talked about the previous 25 years. Legal action and the infrastructure which sits behind it is a long-term endeavour, both for philanthropy and for civil society. And that kind of shift to longer-term core grant making is actually going to be the key to empowering those organisations and to making it accessible to communities who are currently left out over the longer term. So I'm really excited to hear your perspectives on the way that you're using legal actions and the questions that you have coming out of this edition. But I'll stop there and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much, David. And just to follow from what David said, please do share some of your experiences in the chat, whether you're a foundation or an NGO that's in receipt of funding on legal efforts and issues. Do share them with us, and we'll try to get some more perspective from all of you in a moment. I'm going to turn now the floor to Lorenzo Wakefield, who is the Programme Officer for the Mott Foundation in Southern Africa and a former lawyer who's been working on issues around people-centred justice and community paralegals and the kinds of support that seem to be resonating with many of you in that first poll. So delighted to welcome you, Lorenzo. Thank you also for your article for the issue. Can you just really start by just explaining what people-centred justice looks to you and to colleagues at the Mott Foundation, and whether that's always been the approach of your foundation, or whether there's actually been an evolution of the kind that Nicolette described at Ford?
Sure. Thanks so much, Charles. And firstly, let me just start off by congratulating Alliance for its 25-year anniversary, and also to Nicolette and to David for putting this really thoughtful special edition on the intersection of law and justice and philanthropy together. I found some really great articles in there in this edition. So people-centered justice, the way we see it is that that people's justice issues gets resolved where they find them. So it's not necessarily one in which moves away from the court system, but rather one that solves people's problems where they are found outside of that system. But before I want to start with that, I've organized my thoughts into three categories. One is basically the sort of journey of the Mott Foundation since we've started this work, and then also going then to speak a little bit more about people-centered justice, and then finally about the Legal Empowerment Fund that I've written about, that we're hoping to, or which we will be launching in the second half of this year. So Mott's approach has always been, as is in the article, for the last almost 3 decades, we've been supporting a sort of paralegal infrastructure in South Africa. And what that looked like is that paralegals work in community advice offices, and advice offices were seen during the during the time of apartheid was seen as the meeting place for community resistance against the injustices of apartheid in South Africa. After 1994, that changed a little bit because we entered a democratic era in South Africa. And while we've entered a democratic era in South Africa, we've not really done away with injustices as such. So a lot of the work of the advice officers was centered around addressing injustices or sort of doing justice service delivery as such. And we've been supporting that work ever since at the Mott Foundation. We've also hoping that this essentially is a government function in South Africa. It's in our constitution, and hoping that somewhere along the way, well, hopefully in the next while, we'd get some government financing in for the justice service provision of this work. More recent developments at the Mott Foundation can be found in our new civil society program plan, which goes from 2019 through to 2028. In which we're expanding our justice grant-making approach to 4 additional countries beyond South Africa, where we will support paralegal, community-driven justice issues in countries such as Malawi, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa. And the second part of that work is where we will be supporting, where we are supporting currently, continental learning and sharing work. So in other words, what we can learn from these types of movements and paralegal organizations across countries, but also to create some form of an Africa movement to speak about things about financing community-based justice or people-centered justice work, and also elevate that not just at a continental level, but also at a global level, because we find that normally it's non-profit, it's non-profit organizations working in this field who do not actually have the abilities or the resources to attend global fora where important discussions are held because of financing, because it's expensive, because of visas, because of all these barriers that stand in the way to advocate for their own work. Now, why have we decided to focus on people-centered justice? A big answer is that the justice gap is large and it continues to grow in this time especially. The 2019 Justice for All report found that 5.1 billion people in the world lack access to meaningful justice solutions. And the majority of these people also do not really have the financial means to appoint lawyers or to help them with their problems. But more importantly in many of these instances, lawyers are not always needed to solve day-to-day injustice or justice problems. So community paralegals here play a crucial role as they are normally situated within communities, and therefore they are trusted by members of the community, but also because they understand the nature of the injustices that their communities face. And so not only then do they provide a service, but more and more they're involved in campaigns to link the systemic injustices to systemic reforms. And that links to what Nicolette was saying in her remarks initially about bringing the 2 points together to say that it's not either or, it's not just strategic litigation over community approaches, but largely it's strategic litigation that's also informed by community approaches. And I'm mindful of time, so I have some examples, but I'm not going to mention them. I'd rather keep them about where this has successfully happened for the conversation, and rather just quickly turn to the Legal Empowerment Fund as such. And the Legal Empowerment Fund was sort of raised as an idea by the United Nations Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor in 2005 or 2006, around there. And more recently, a sort of global legal empowerment network, which is a network of practitioners, did a survey amongst them, and where they found that one of the issues that grassroots legal empowerment organizations that are normally staffed by paralegals face is that they're severely underfunded. And that was one of the reasons why we thought to bring our resources together in some way to address this, to address the underfunding of this grassroots movement, but also to contribute towards the global efforts around financing justice. So the fund that we're trying to, that we will be launching is a sort of seen as a 10-year fund, which will be hosted by the Fund for Global Human Rights. And it's also intended to contribute towards SDG 16.3 on access to justice, And the goal is to raise $100 million over the next 10 years with the help of both philanthropy and bilateral and multilateral government donors as well. I'll put some more details of a contact person at the Fund for Global Human Rights for anyone who's in the call and would like to hear more information and get involved with that. And then so I'm going to end that for year 9, and maybe we can go to the discussions and I can answer some more questions.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your thoughts. And it would be good to come back to you in a moment during the questions to share some examples of some of the successes you've seen. There were 1 or 2 people in the chats asking for inspiration from your own experiences. I think that was a point from Anne Keane. But thank you very much. And will also be good to see how the Legal Empowerment Fund goes over time, who funds it, and where those funds are coming from and where they're directed. So thanks for bringing people's attention to that new fund through colleagues at the Fund for Global Human Rights. I'd like to turn now just to our second poll before we go into the discussion. If you look on, click on the poll tab in the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a question which really is looking forward to the next 25 years. Looking at the next 25 years, which of the following areas should legal funders prioritize? First option is improving the legal environment for domestic and cross-border philanthropy. The second option, challenging restrictions on civil society by populist and or authoritarian regimes. A third area, pursuing climate litigation to ensure companies and governments meet emissions targets. We haven't talked so much about climate or climate litigation, but clearly that's a growing area of interest too. But I know there's many other areas too that you might want to see legal philanthropy focused on in the next 25 years. So please do write any additional areas in the chat and do respond to the poll now. Thank you. I'm just going to give a few moments for you to do that and to get some more numbers coming through. Okay, well, thank you. I'm just looking at the initial results. I mean, we're seeing a good number of you saying that climate litigation is important and will continue to be important. That's 20%. 15% of you identifying the legal environment for domestic and cross-border philanthropy, but a resounding majority of 62% emphasizing the importance of challenging restrictions on civil society by populist or authoritarian regimes. And that certainly is a theme that appears in the issue. There's an article from Germany that highlights some of the challenges there. So it's clearly an issue in the north as well as the south, that particular question. There's also a question of law reform, which I think Duncan Wilson mentioned from the Sigrid Rousing Trust in the chat. It's a question of reforming existing laws as well as trying to push for new ones. So thank you for your responses there. I'm going to go to some questions now. The first one is one that's been submitted in advance by Mohit Mukim, who is a PhD student at Stanford University's Law School. And that again touches on some of the questions raised in the chats. And he asks, what strategies for legal change are most compelling? He says, there's a lot of talk at my law school about movement lawyering, an approach that calls on lawyers to defer to the needs of organizers from frontline communities in order to fight for transformative change. And one way to practice this approach is to assist community groups in building alternative economic structures like community-run food, energy, and housing cooperatives to meet basic needs. Do funders anticipate these approaches as appealing approaches to be supported? And for that, I'm going to turn now just to Nicolette, just to respond to that question. Over to you, Nicolette.
Thanks, Charles. I definitely agree that movement lawyering, and again, I think we've seen in the chat to be careful about one size fits all. Context does matter. But I think in the current moment, there's been a recognition that for lawyering to be successful for social justice or for social change, it has to go as close as possible to the communities that need it. And I think the piece by Jim Goldstone and Martin O'Brien make that point quite clearly, and a few of the other authors also make that point. And movement lawyering really aims to get us there. And I think it's not without its tensions and its difficulties, because often you have the needs of the movement may not always align with the needs of the lawyers in the test case or the jurisprudence that you want to develop. So sometimes a lawyer may want to develop the law in a certain direction as a test case versus the community's needs and a movement's needs in a different direction. And I think that's where the tension does happen. And that's something that we do have to grapple with. But I think that happens in any of the funding we're doing, where we're really going as close to the root of the problem and as close to the communities that's most affected. We always have to ask ourselves whose interests are being represented and how are we representing the interests of those most affected. So I think in any of our change strategies, whether you are a funder that's funding movement lawyering, when you're funding change, these are the questions we are asking ourselves. And I think the movement in philanthropy is generally going in the direction of that's where we need to get as close as possible to.
Thank you, Nicolette. I'm going to pass over in a moment to David Sampson just to also address that question, but also one other from Martin O'Brien, who was just mentioned, who asks whether you have any ideas about how to encourage donors to give more consideration to using the law as part of their change toolboxes. So, in other words, those funders that are maybe not specialist legal funders, what can be done to expand their interest in backing or engaging with legal approaches? Over to you, David, for that.
Thanks, Charles. To build off Nicolette's comments for a moment, I think that one of the central pieces for us around the idea of movement lawyering is how you build the infrastructure of civil society as a foundation which has had a long-term interest in how civil society achieves social change. One of the questions I think that we continue to struggle with as an organisation is how you create the networks between organisations which can be seen as legal and those which are not. What's the ideal ecosystem of civil society organising which allows these things to work and sit in place to allow lawyers to really be embedded in those movements, to really be part of that social change activity rather than sitting alongside it or distantly removed from it. One of the things that we've found is that as a foundation, we have to be more experimental in the way that we're choosing to do that funding. It doesn't just come through core support for one organisation or even longer term objectives of funding partnership work. It's about continuing to use the networks and connections that we have to build on that over time. In terms of Martin's question, I think that there is a question, I think, for broader philanthropy about how we continue to build these networks and create spaces for people to be able to explore this kind of grant making. I think that's happening at the national level often more effectively than it is at the global level. And one of the things which has really been highlighted for me in this edition is that we need to look more beyond our own borders to be able to understand the kind of work which is being done. We run an international development program at the foundation which works in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the things I've been really struck by in all of the work that we do there is that the strategies, that many of which were talked about in this edition, are far ahead of us in terms of the way that they're rooted in broader social change movements. And I would like to see philanthropy investing more in building those kind of connections and understanding to be able to bring people who are thinking about this work and strategize. And if others on this call are interested in how we might be able to do that more effectively and perhaps formalize some communities of practice around this work, I'd be really interested to hear ideas.
Thank you, David. I'm just now going to turn in a moment to Lorenzo to bring together a couple of questions in the chat. One is from Emma Playfair, and the other is from Norman Silber. Emma asks, and they're both related to the topic of legal education, you might say. One is around strengthening judges' learning in these areas. Emma asks what can be done by philanthropy to, if you like, educate judges. And Norman's asking about law schools and what they can and should be doing, both in their projects, fellowships, programs, supporting students, or by other means and tools. Lorenzo, do you want to comment on that? And then Nicolette, you might, if you have a comment on those questions, then please do come in after Lorenzo as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks for those questions. I'm going to start with the last question first. So, sort of looking at law schools and what they can and should be doing. I think that practice has shown that, South Africa has a long history of paralegal practice that stretches for a very long time. And so I think that what we've learned is that law schools play a huge role in educating paralegals as well on the roles, on the duties, on what the law says they can and cannot do. So it's not necessarily seen as a competitive role to lawyers, or as somehow seeing it as a mini role of what lawyers can and cannot do. We see it as the sort of hierarchy of legal practice, for example. If you're looking at the medical profession, you have from community healthcare workers that stretches all the way through to specialist doctors. And the same in the legal sphere is how we see it as well. You have community paralegals that sort of work in communities. You have lawyers that do general practicing. You have lawyers that do specialized practicing. And they have their own assistants and advocates and barristers all working in different spheres of the law. So there is a definite role for law schools to play. In South Africa, there's law schools that started actually creating accredited courses for paralegals and for community paralegals. And this has all helped in building that evidence base for government to support their work. So if you want to define what's a community paralegal, you look at what's the education that they've received. There are diploma courses at some universities, and there's also a bachelor's degree in paralegal studies at one of the universities in Cape Town that we now source. But we as a Mott Foundation are trying to support more access to get paralegals into that program and to get them to be able to successfully see it through and get a degree in paralegal studies as such. So there is a role for law schools. On the educating of judges, I think that a lot of the campaigns broadly in the sort of African sphere of paralegal work has actually brought judges along with it. If I think that in 2017 at the launch of the African Center of Excellence on Access to Justice in Kigali, in Rwanda, three chief justices were there, and there was a huge contingent of judges that were also part of this as well. And in that, they've actually sort of in the continent, at least some of them have realized that there is a role for paralegals to play. They might not be the ones who's going to represent someone in the court because they don't have a right of appearance, but there would be someone who can help with getting people's papers together, referring matters that need lawyers to lawyers like legal aid lawyers or NPOs that do have free legal services. But there is a role to play in educating even further. But I do think the judiciary has a role in that regard. There's one element of the work that I quickly want to touch on in this education field as well, and that is the role of activism and community activism. Many paralegals are seen as community activists within their communities. And therefore, the thing that or at least what we found is lacking is that they are so far so distant from big cities in the way paralegals work. They work in rural areas, they work in far-flung areas, there's no internet connection or poor internet connection, and not necessarily in capitals and big cities. And so the activism is sort of seen as always in isolation and not necessarily as one that connects. And I think one of the work that we're trying to explore at the Mott Foundation, at least in South Africa on that field now, is how to support that solidarity around activism of community paralegals so that their voices are elevated also in the spaces when it comes to having discussions in urban communities about the injustices that the urban communities face and their work as well, and show that that is important in this ecosystem as well.
Thank you. Could you point to just briefly just to an example of that, Lorenzo, from your work at the Mott Foundation?
an example of the activism angle?
Or an example of the activism you've helped to fund, or the brokering of that activism with some of the people in decision-making positions in cities.
Yeah, that's still really quite at a nascent stage right now. We're just exploring it with the centre that deals with activist education work in South Africa. But an example I can bring across is the Hands of Our Grants campaign. And in South Africa, the Hands of Our Grants campaign, what happened was that many paralegals in communities across South Africa, which is a huge country, have picked up that social grant recipient holders, specifically older people, are standing at ATMs in the middle of the night, close to midnight, before the grants are paid into their bank accounts. And what was picked up on was that this is not just happening in one area; it's happening in so many areas across the countries. And what that showed was, and then when these community paralegals got together, they realized this is actually happening everywhere. So together with an organization working on advocacy issues around this, they did a bit of digging and research and found out that the company that the government has contracted to deliver the social grants has sold their private information to microlenders, who then have preyed on social grant recipient holders. Now, we're talking about social grant recipient holders in South Africa are basically like people living in poverty. It's not, you need to qualify to get a social grant, and there's not a lot of money. And realize that they've been preying on them to go into and to enter into loan agreements with exorbitant interest rates that they would pay off for years and years and years, which was exploitative in that regard. As part of that research, that evidence-based work actually elevated to a court case and used strategic litigators in the same process to get an order to basically require anyone dealing with social grant recipient holders cannot share the private information of social grant recipient holders in this regard. And we saw that as a win. It's not necessarily over, but it was a major win in this fight to make sure that loan sharks and microlenders are not preying on poor and marginalized people in this way.
Yeah, thank you. And that really underscores the point that's been made, that these aren't binary choices in terms of the direction of funding. And that in that example, paralegals and strategic litigation came together. And good to hear about the result that was achieved there. If I can turn to you briefly, Nicolette, if you would like to comment on anything you've been hearing in that discussion, and then I'll turn to a question from Max Rutherford. Over to you, Nicolette. Sorry, Nicolette, we need your microphone.
Sorry. I wanted to touch a bit on Emma's question, because I think a lot of the work in this space historically has started with support for the building the infrastructure has to start at law schools and how we support law schools. And Ford often started its work through supporting law schools and the academic practice in this space. And I think we have to now start thinking about how do we support there could be funders working in the education space that are interested in, doesn't mean because you're working in education, you can't be supporting the work that's happening within law schools. And the exciting work that Lorenzo's pointed out and the role that law schools can play in how we rethink and reimagine legal action and reimagine justice and social justice in this space is important. But that we also start thinking about what does multidisciplinary approaches look like within academic institutions? How do you support multidisciplinary within the humanities, within other schools as well, to start to think about the role of the law and the role of the law in bringing about social change and solving problems alongside others. I think a lot of our work has tried to bring together researchers, and a lot of the most successful legal campaigns that we've seen happening that have really shifted hearts and minds and shifted laws have involved these multidisciplinary players where you bring in different stakeholders together along with lawyers. So I think the historic approach of supporting law schools, judges, is something that needs to happen, but we also need to expand that into a more interdisciplinary approach to the work.
Thank you, Nicolette. I was aware of Ford Foundation's historic work in supporting business schools. Wasn't so familiar with its work supporting law schools, so that's good to hear that there might be an agenda for the foundation there. I'm going to turn now to Max Rutherford's question from the UK's Association of Charitable Foundations. Perhaps I can put this one to David Sampson, his compatriot in the UK at the Baring Foundation. And he raises a question that while foundations within the membership of ACF are being supported to use law as a tool for achieving their missions, the question is raised about whether there's a risk of legal action supported by philanthropy becoming an arms race between people on different sides of the political divide. Something, of course, we have seen in America. Could we see it in the are we seeing it in the UK and elsewhere, where philanthropy is essentially backing litigation in its own image? And is there a risk about that to the kind of independence and standing of philanthropy? Over to you, David.
Hi, Max. Good to hear from the Association of Charitable Foundations on this topic and the work that you're doing in this area. I think it's something that we have to be concerned and pay close attention to. And within our article, we unpack some of the data on where funding is going to, as well as from, in relation to this kind of work. And it's noticeable that it sits on both sides of what might be seen as the social change divide. And so it could be conceived as a real threat. I suppose the view that I take is that if philanthropy takes some of the approaches which have been explored today in terms of rooting this work clearly in movements and in a broad range of social change activities, we at least mitigate those risks, because it allows both the work to be driven by those communities rather than dictated by the funders, which takes some of the heat out of that potential exchange. But it also leads to litigation which is developed by those communities through the need and the advantages they see of that process, rather than because we see it as the way of being able to develop a society in our own image, as you said, Charles. Inevitably, any litigation can go both ways, and we've seen in the UK in recent past, to some extent, the backlash against the use of litigation as a way of challenging government decision making, and we're currently facing the independent review of administrative law in broad terms, which could really close down the space for civil society using litigation to challenge a range of different areas of public decision making, as well as a broader review of our human rights infrastructure. So it can lead to worrying aspects of response on the other side of some of these issues. I think it's also important to think about that in the terms of what success looks like. And Nicolette alluded to this when she was first speaking at the beginning of this hour. And I don't think, and nor do I think it's borne out in the edition, that winning or losing in the courtroom is the only way or the only metric for success in this field. And so often what feels like a loss brought on by the kind of funding that we support will lead to broader and longer term social change. And we have to invest in the capacity of organizations to be able to pivot and use different mechanisms to be able to pursue the kind of judgments that they receive and understand the risks that they take in doing that.
Thank you. And I've just got time just to bring in a short comment from Duncan Wilson at the Sigrid Rousing Trust, who I mentioned earlier. And Lorenzo and Nicolette, you might just want to respond to this as your and make any final closing remarks. Duncan's question is, does any of the panel have lessons to share for how legal strategies can most effectively lead to systemic culture change? That is building better practice, not only correcting the worst practices. I'll go first to Lorenzo there, and then to Nicolette.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, Duncan, for that question. I've tried to answer it in the chat as well. It's a very good question because the answer is that it's really hard, right? Going like David just mentioned, like getting a win in the court doesn't actually mean any form of social change. But I do think that Jackson Otieno's piece in the special edition speaks to that. specifically it relates how it relates to LGBT activism in East Africa and the work that they've been doing in that. And the title says it all, it's not just a question of the law, right? The law is only, really in that case, is just the start of it. And then, but changing cultures is hard work, and it's generational, I find, necessarily. We're not going to get that change immediately. So I don't have an answer to Duncan's question as such. I'm sorry, Duncan, but it is a bit harder than just winning a legal case. As a sort of closing, I think that I'd like to think that financing is important in this field that we currently find ourselves in. The SDG development agenda means that we need to start financing that as a development agenda and not just see it as a sort of civil and political rights document. So I think that and it's not just about like drawing into our pockets and putting our checks and writing them. That's important, but it's also about doing the right financing in this field, making sure that independence of community groups are kept, making sure that the issues that they face are addressed and not necessarily dictated by those with pockets of money. And I think that if in my parting shot, I'd like to encourage those who would like to be part of joining the efforts in elevating this legal empowerment fund and contributing towards it and joining also in our thinking around it, to please reach out because we feel that the aim is going to possibly be some exciting work to take forward and to address.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And you can see details about the Legal Empowerment Fund, I think, in the chat for those that want to explore that further. Nicolette, just a very brief closing response from you, please. Again, we need your microphone.
Thanks for that. I was thinking of the Treatment Action Campaign's work in South Africa as a social movement around HIV/AIDS and really shifting the hearts and minds of people, not only taking a legal case for antiretroviral treatment, shifting government policy, the South African government that was denying HIV/AIDS, not giving access to treatment, shifting government policy at scale, but also the HIV positive t-shirt, starting a conversation with ordinary South Africans around stigma and discrimination, getting Nelson Mandela to put on a HIV positive t-shirt. That mobilization strategy, the insider-outsider approach of the Treatment Action Campaign and the lawyers and the doctors and the treatment literacy work is a good example of funding work that brings about the culture change and the legal change piece. And I would just like to encourage people to engage with the issue and also speak to other funders who are funding in this space. If you have questions, if you're wanting to dip your toe in the water, I encourage funders to really take some risks, be bold, and see law as a tool for bringing about change.
Yeah, and that's a great note to end on contributions from the panelists on seeing law as a tool, and that legal change and social and cultural change are both interrelated and interconnected. And that's where the shift to reimagining justice that has been articulated might be one we will certainly be keeping our eye on and encourage you to do the same. But that brings us to the end of our webinar. And if you've enjoyed today's discussion, despite the technical problems at my end, and I'm sorry about those. I hope it didn't detract too much from your engagement with this conversation, but please do check out Alliance's ongoing coverage of legal philanthropy. And don't forget to subscribe now to get 20% off if you haven't already, using the offers tab on the right-hand side of your screen. I'd like to say a very big thank you to our expert panelists, Nicolette Naylor at the Ford Foundation, David Sampson at the Baring Foundation, and Lorenzo Wakefield at the Mott Foundation. Thanks to all of you for your contributions today. And thanks to the Alliance team, in particular our events and marketing manager, Amy McGoldrick, and indeed Zibran Chowdhury, our communications manager, who jointly produced today's event. Reaching 25 years old in the world of non-profit media, as we've done now at Alliance, is not something that any of us take for granted. So I'd like to say a big thanks to all of you here and everyone in the global philanthropy sector for the trust you continue to place in us to hold a mirror up to our field. You can join Alliance's Ella Karuhi next month for the next webinar on our anniversary series at 5 p.m. GMT on the 20th of April. Ella will be joined by some guests to discuss where philanthropy in Latin America is headed. Invites to sign up for that will be coming your way, so please keep an eye out for those, or visit alliancemagazine.org/webinars. But until then, thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye.